You've probably seen it. A video that went absolutely viral, giving this really tough verdict on Jacinda Ardern's time as New Zealand's Prime Minister. And it claims it's not based on feelings or politics, but on cold, hard, measurable outcomes. It's slick, it's powerful, and boy, did it make an impact.
And this is the final punchline, the big conclusion. It basically says that on everything that matters, debt, housing, how united the country is, her leadership was a total failure. It's a huge claim, and it paints a really simple, really damning picture. And that's exactly what we are going to dig into. See, the video is clever. It uses real numbers and real quotes. But as we all know, you can use real facts to tell a story that isn't, well, entirely true. So we're going to go claim by claim, add back the context that got left on the cutting room floor, and see if that story still holds up. Okay, first up, the debt. This is the claim that really set the internet on fire. This idea that national debt just exploded under her government. The video frames it as totally reckless spending. And here's the number they hit you with. $92 billion. The video says, correctly, that net core crown debt went up by about that much. And let's be honest, that number looks catastrophic. On its own, it's a jaw-dropper. So here's the thing. That number, it's totally correct. But it's a number presented in a total vacuum. What's missing? Oh, just a little thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. Both the Treasury and the Auditor General are really clear that this spending was the direct result of the pandemic response. And this wasn't some uniquely Kiwi thing. Pretty much every developed country on Earth was doing the same thing. Okay, now this is where it gets really sneaky. The video uses this very specific, kind of obscure measure called net core crown debt. And here's the kicker. This particular measurement deliberately ignores all the assets in New Zealand's massive sovereign wealth fund. It's literally like calculating your debt, but pretending your entire life savings doesn't exist. And would you look at the difference that makes? The cherry-picked number they use puts debt at about 42% of GDP. But if you use the standard international measure, the one the IMF and everyone else uses to compare countries, which includes those savings, the number gets cut in half, down to about 20%. Same economy, just two wildly different ways of looking at it, and one looks a heck of a lot scary. And here it is, the big picture. When you actually compare apples to apples with the rest of the world, New Zealand's debt wasn't a crisis at all. In fact, it was one of the lowest in the developed world, way lower than Australia, Canada, the UK, the US, you name it. So yeah, the spending happened, but the whole crisis story, it only works if you pick the one number that looks the worst. All right, let's move on to claim number 2, the housing market. The video paints this picture of a complete disaster that was unique to Ardern's time in office. I mean, that is some strong language. Worse in our history. It makes it sound like this was a singular, unprecedented failure, and it was all one government's fault. But, and you're probably sensing a theme here, the global context is just gone. First, anyone in New Zealand will tell you that housing has been a massive, growing problem for decades across many different governments. Second, that huge price surge, it was powered by ridiculously low interest rates that were a worldwide phenomenon because of the pandemic. Almost every advanced economy on the planet saw this exact same housing boom and then the same correction. To frame it as just a New Zealand problem is to ignore the elephant in the room. Now for the third claim. This one shifts away from money and moves on to leadership style, trying to paint Ardern as some kind of authoritarian who wanted total control. And this quote is Exhibit A. I mean, you hear that and, wow, it sounds chilling. Straight out of a dystopian movie, right? But what's missing is that it was said during a press conference in the chaotic, confusing early days of the pandemic, specifically about how to fight a tidal wave of dangerous misinformation. So that's the real question, isn't it? Was this an authoritarian power grab, or was it a maybe clumsy attempt to say, hey, for official health advice, come to the official sources during a massive public health emergency? It's pretty interesting that at the time, international media like The Washington Post were actually calling her approach a masterclass in crisis communication. And that whole idea of arbitrary power really crumbles when you look at the actual government documents. This is from a cabinet paper about how they decided on lockdown levels. It wasn't just a whim. You can see right here they were running detailed models on the economic impact of every single choice they were considering. In fact, there was a whole formal process. It wasn't just one thing. They had to weigh the health advice against the economic damage, think about the social impact on the most vulnerable people, and even consider whether the public would actually understand and follow the rules.
This wasn't a dictatorship, it was a data-driven balancing act.
Okay, let's zoom back out to that huge, sweeping final verdict that Ardern left New Zealand poorer and more divided. We've tackled the economic claims, so let's zero in on that last part, more divided.
Now, division can just be a feeling, sure, but one of the key ways you can actually measure it economically is by looking at income inequality, the gap between the richest and the poorest. If a society is getting more divided, you'd expect to see that gap getting wider. And the video really wants you to believe that's what happened.
But the official data from New Zealand's own treasury tells the exact opposite story. This chart shows 4 different ways of measuring inequality, and on every single one of them, the gap didn't get bigger during her time in office. It actually got smaller. By the government's own numbers, the country became less, not more, economically divided during this period. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? Well, we've seen time and again how the video's biggest claims, which seem so powerful, start to look really different the second you add the context back in.
And that's really the trick, isn't it? It's a formula. You take a real number, but you strip out the once-in-a-century pandemic that explains it. You talk about a real housing problem, but you erase the decades of history and the global forces behind it. You take a real quote, but you remove the emergency context that gives it meaning. You make a claim about division that the actual data just doesn't support. And that really leaves us with one last question to think about. It's so easy to get pulled in by a story that sounds confident and uses big, scary numbers. But if that story is deliberately leaving out the most important pieces of the puzzle, you have to ask yourself, is the point to actually inform me, or is it to influence me? And whose agenda does that story really serve?